welcome to the latest in our series of webinars at the Eno Center for Transportation. My name is Brianne Eby, and I'm a policy analyst here at Eno. Today we're presenting From Yellow to Green, Reducing School Transportation's Impact on the Environment. America's fleet of roughly 480,000 school buses drives nearly 3.5 billion miles every year. More than half of students also travel to school in personal vehicles, contributing millions of miles for school transportation. Daily trips to and from school have significant environmental effects for students and their communities. All of these vehicles emit millions of tons of greenhouse gases per year into the environment, contributing to global warming, and expose children to harmful pollutants that can affect their health and academic performance. In a new policy brief, From Yellow to Green, Reducing School Transportation's Impact on the Environment, Bellwether Education Partners analyzed how school transportation affects the environment and what steps states and districts can take to provide more environmentally friendly transportation services. This webinar, hosted by the brief's co-author Philip Burgoyne-Allen, will provide an overview of the school transportation policy landscape, school transportation's environmental impact, and the costs and benefits of a number of impact reduction strategies. After his presentation, we will have plenty of time for questions. For those listening in, you are encouraged to submit questions and comments through the questions function on the webinar website. You don't have to wait until Philip is done to submit these questions. You can do it at any time. Thanks all again for taking the time to join us. And with that, take it away, Philip.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar. And thank you to the Eno Center for Transportation for hosting us. My name is Philip Burgoyne-Allen, and I'm an analyst on the Policy and Evaluation team at Bellwether Education Partners. We are a national nonprofit focused on dramatically changing education and life outcomes for underserved children. Here you'll see a list of our recent publications on school transportation, including our comprehensive report, Miles to Go, and our animated video, Better Buses, both released in 2017. As well as a slide deck and 3 new policy briefs released earlier this year. You can find all of these reports on our website at bellwethereducation.org, but today's webinar will focus on our From Yellow to Green brief. The goals for today's webinar, one is to provide a high-level overview of the school transportation sector, including related challenges and opportunities for states and districts. We'll also dive deeper into school transportation's environmental impact, including impact reduction strategies like electric buses. And then I'll have some time at the end as well to answer questions and direct folks to any additional resources on school transportation as needed. I'll start with a quick overview of the school transportation sector, followed by a deeper dive into school transportation's environmental impact. And then, as I said, we'll have some time at the end for questions. Every day, roughly 480,000 school buses transport nearly a third of students to and from school. This fleet is more than twice the size of all other forms of mass transit combined, including public transit, passenger rail, and air travel. The 3 primary service models used for school transportation are district-owned and operated fleets of yellow school buses, contracted yellow bus service provided by private companies, and public transit. Many districts use a combination of these service models rather than using just one, and that is especially true in large urban districts. As you can see here, challenges related to school transportation affect students and families in districts across the country. Some of the most common challenges we see time and time again in the news are delayed buses and driver shortages, both of which make it difficult for students to reach school safely and on time. Districts and contractors both face a number of challenges when providing transportation services for students. This includes a complex regulatory environment with both federal and state rules, stagnant transportation funding, and a number of other budget challenges related to educating students. The growth of school choice policies that allow students to attend schools beyond their neighborhood is also a challenge, as it thus means that students can travel farther to get to school, which has implications for transportation. Limited data and poor data quality on fleets and operations is another challenge that districts and states face, as well as high expectations for student safety, despite other challenges. And lastly, a large impact on the environment is one challenge of school transportation. This is driven in part by an over-reliance on older diesel buses. And this last challenge here will be the focus of our webinar today. Our research shows that these challenges can lead to a number of negative outcomes for districts, but there are opportunities for improvement and innovation. Taking advantage of basic technologies like GPS and routing software can help districts make better and more informed decisions about transportation that ultimately can help drive efficiency and cost effectiveness. Similarly, investing in new buses and infrastructure requires higher upfront costs, but these investments can lead to long-term savings. This is also an important component of reducing environmental impact, as I will discuss shortly. Related to this need for investment is the need for additional transportation funding, as well as funding formulas that incentivize districts to operate efficient transportation systems. Finally, increased collaboration, both between district staff who are often siloed in their various areas of focus, like enrollment for students or student transportation, is needed in order to pursue a more effective strategy for how transportation systems can work along with the education system. And in addition, collaboration is needed across sectors as well, specifically between the education and transportation sectors, which can help pursue more comprehensive efforts at both providing more efficient and effective transportation for students, and as I'll explain later, also help with environmental impact. So next I will talk about some more about the environmental impact of school transportation. School buses drive nearly 3.5 billion miles each year, transporting nearly a third of students to and from school. The vast majority of these buses run on diesel fuel, and most also lack related clean air technologies that can help reduce emissions and pollution. The majority of students also travel to school in personal vehicles, like cars, which contribute many millions more miles of travel for school transportation, as well as additional emissions and pollution. All of this transportation negatively affects the environment by emitting greenhouse gases that contribute to global warming. Research has also shown that exposure to emissions and pollution from school transportation can harm students' physical health, especially for children with asthma, and this exposure can even hurt their test scores. There are a number of strategies that states and districts can pursue to reduce environmental impact. Some of these, like reducing idling time and retrofitting buses, can be implemented with existing diesel buses. Other strategies, like using propane and CNG school buses, those are buses powered by compressed natural gas, as well as electric school buses, require purchasing new buses that replace older diesel buses. Specifically, propane and CNG buses can have environmental benefits when used to replace these older buses, but they have similar environmental concerns as the newest and cleanest diesel buses. Electric school buses similarly can be used to replace diesel school buses, but they are much cleaner for the environment, as I will explain shortly. Investing in additional infrastructure is also a component of these strategies, specifically with purchasing new buses to replace diesel buses, as well as to encourage walking and biking by having the necessary safety infrastructure in place. These strategies all have a number of benefits and challenges as well. Reducing idling time and retrofitting buses both have relatively low upfront costs. Research has also shown that the reduction in emissions resulting from retrofits can improve students' health and academic outcomes, but reducing idling time relies heavily on driver training, which can be a challenge when drivers have high turnover rates. This is a fairly common occurrence in many districts across the country. Alternatively fueled buses have lower fuel costs and require less maintenance than diesel buses, which can lead to long-term savings. Electric buses can further reduce energy costs using vehicle-to-grid technology. This technology allows buses' batteries to interact with the overall electrical grid rather than simply draw a charge from it. And so this technology can allow batteries to charge at low use times and then return energy to the grid during high use times. And doing this can help reduce the cost of utilities. However, these buses do cost substantially more than diesel buses, especially electric buses, and they require infrastructure investments like fueling stations and charging stations. Electric school buses also require close coordination with local utility companies and close management of charging plans as well, which has been a challenge for districts, as I will discuss. Lastly, encouraging walking and biking can reduce the number of vehicles needed for school transportation, including both buses and cars. However, the extent to which students can walk and bike to school is determined in part by how far they live from the school that they attend. Emissions and fuel use data also clearly show that electric buses are the most environmentally friendly vehicle option for school transportation. They use less petroleum and they emit fewer greenhouse gases than new diesel buses, as the charts here show. And then the bottom chart shows that they also create very little pollution, like carbon monoxide and nitrous oxides, as well as particulate matter and volatile organic compounds. All of these types of pollution can have various negative effects on students' health. Our brief includes case studies of districts piloting the use of electric school buses in California, Massachusetts, and New York. And you can also see our From Yellow to Green report for more detail on each of those. What we learned from these case studies is that using electric school buses requires multiple partners and funding sources, including bus manufacturers, state agencies, and local utility companies. The effectiveness of electric school buses can also be limited by implementation challenges, like charging buses for too long, charging them at peak times for energy use, and other inefficient charging practices. This challenge underscores the need for close coordination between districts and other pilot partners. Pilot programs also still need to demonstrate the potential benefits of vehicle-to-grid technology. One of the pilot programs we reviewed began testing these capabilities this summer, but the results of that still remain to be seen. So that will be a major point of demonstration for these pilot programs going forward. And finally, electric school buses are currently too expensive for districts to purchase on their own, and that makes it challenging for districts to be able to operate these buses on a larger scale that can increase the benefits from things like vehicle-to-grid technology as well. There are a number of programs that provide funding to help reduce the environmental impact of transportation, including school transportation specifically. Federal funding sources include the Diesel Emissions Reduction Act, as well as funding under the FAST Act, which supports transportation alternatives. These alternatives include things like walking and biking, often referred to as safe routes to school, and the funding can be used to help with infrastructure or with initiatives at the local level that can help encourage those options. There are also many state programs that provide incentives like reimbursements, zero interest loans, and other types of grants and funding opportunities that can be used to retrofit older diesel buses with new clean air technologies, or to purchase new buses that are powered by alternative fuels. Funding is also available to states from the recent Volkswagen settlement after the company admitted to cheating on vehicle emissions tests in 2015. That funding is currently being distributed to states for projects designed to reduce harmful emissions from diesel vehicles. And those programs vary widely across states, but a number of states are using that funding specifically to help reduce the impact of school transportation by improving or replacing current school buses in their fleet. However, these programs are far from sufficient, especially if the goal is to increase the share of electric school buses that comprise America's fleet of school buses. As an example, districts spend a total of roughly $25 billion each year for school transportation. However, if all of that money were used to purchase new electric buses, it would only replace a little less than 20% of diesel school buses at current cost levels. So in order to significantly increase the share of electric buses, costs will need to come down in the future. There are also a variety of barriers, primarily high upfront costs, as well as tight budgets among districts that already struggle to provide transportation. And these things certainly are barriers to reducing the impact of school transportation on the environment. But there are still steps that states and districts, as well as other leaders in the education and transportation sectors, can take to reduce school transportation's environmental impact. First, states, districts, and other local agencies need a shared vision for school transportation that sets clear goals and considers factors like what modes of transportation are already available to students and what additional infrastructure might be needed to support other modes of transportation, like walking and biking, or to support the implementation of new alternatively fueled buses. School transportation systems also need more information on students' transportation needs, as well as the composition of current fleets of vehicles and data on the efficiency of current transportation operations. Many districts lack even that sort of basic information on some of the operations of their transportation systems. In addition, state funding mechanisms need to consider the costs and benefits of environmental investments, and federal and state funding sources need to provide more support for adopting impact reduction strategies, as I mentioned before. And finally, innovative partnerships and increased collaboration across sectors can lead to more comprehensive approaches and help reduce environmental impact from multiple modes of transportation. For example, as we show in our case studies, funding and support for manufacturers, utility companies, and other state and local entities were needed to make it possible for districts to put electric school buses on the road. And similarly, increased collaboration between the education and transportation sectors can help reduce school transportation's environmental impact across multiple modes of transportation. Thank you all for your time. And now, as we mentioned before, I will take some questions from the audience if anyone has anything they'd like more detail on.
Thanks very much, Philip. That was great. Sorry, there was a little bit of feedback there. To everybody that was listening in, don't forget to submit your questions if you have them. We are still accepting those. You'll just do that in the questions function on the webinar website. We've had a couple come in so far, so I'll try to do that and kind of group them together as I can. So there's one here. If you have examples of districts or states that have effectively shown an ability to prioritize reduced emissions in their procurement or in their long-term plans for shifting to lower emission vehicles?
Yes, one of the case studies we present in our brief is of the Twin Rivers Unified School District, located in, it's north of Sacramento in California. And they have really prioritized replacing their diesel buses with electric buses and all other alternatively fueled buses. They were the first district to deploy electric school buses on their own, and they now have they still have the largest fleet of electric school buses of any district in the country. They operate, I believe that they have about 25 electric school buses, and those make up almost 20% of their current transportation fleet. And a significant share of the rest of their buses are powered by compressed natural gas. And in our conversations with them while working on our policy brief, they also told us that one of their plans is to ultimately replace all of their buses with electric. And they even view the compressed natural gas buses as just a stopgap until they can get to 100% electric. So I would say they're definitely one of the headlining examples of a district that is leading the way on reducing the impact of their transportation.
Great, thanks. Wondering if you're seeing any specific strategies that schools or districts are using to support more walking and biking initiatives?
Definitely. We cover this in more depth in some of our recent reports, specifically one of our 3 new policy briefs, the one on student safety, delves into this issue. There are a number of approaches that states and districts can take to try and encourage that. One thing for younger children is a walking school bus, where effectively students meet up together and they all walk to school together, often with adult supervision. Other things like infrastructure improvements, like protected bike lanes, repainting crosswalks, kind of doing the nuts and bolts of making schools safer places to walk to and bike to, can also have an effect. And research has shown that both things like improving awareness of these options and encouraging it through district initiatives, as well as the related safety infrastructure. Research has shown that increasing both of those through programs that encourage safe routes to school does actually improve the number of students who then walk and bike to school.
Great, thanks. Regarding your suggestions about data, do you have any specific suggestions for improving access to data, understanding the type of data that's available, and actual collection methods that school districts can be using?
Certainly. One of the drivers of a lack of good data is also a lack of good technology. The majority of school buses are not equipped with GPS, for example. Only a small majority of school districts use routing software to plan their operations. And even small, in a very small percent, I think it's roughly 5% of districts, based on some survey data that we cover in our briefs, only 5% of school transportation operators equip their buses with student tracking systems. If you're familiar with things like EasyPass or other cards or badges that are equipped with RFID technology, you basically tap onto the bus and tap off the bus, and it helps track where students are getting on and off the bus. So things like GPS, routing software, and student tracking, they can help actually provide that kind of daily data that is needed to make transportation operations most efficient. And if they're more efficient, then that means fewer vehicles are needed, driving fewer miles, and that ultimately does have benefits for the environment. And at the same time, having that type of data can then inform other decisions, like investments in new buses or in walking and biking infrastructure or things like that. So I think investing in the technology side will help on the data side in terms of helping districts make informed decisions going forward.
Great, thank you. This next one sounds like a tough one, where maybe listeners, if you have suggestions, you might want to reach out specifically to Philip and to Bellwether about this. But somebody's wondering if you have any suggestions for convincing school districts to think in terms of the total cost of ownership, so the long-term cost instead of the initial high costs of procuring electric vehicles.
Definitely. I think that is very important. As I discussed, a lot of the impact reduction strategies have higher upfront costs, but can pay off in the long run through related savings. One of the issues we've seen with this relates to how transportation is funded. So these districts, many districts, are already struggling to provide sufficient transportation service for the needs of their students and communities. And on top of that, they also face other budget challenges related to actually educating students in the classroom. In addition to that, the way transportation is funded, often there is not a particular set aside for capital investments. And so it is difficult for districts to have that excess funding available to be able to make those one-time upfront investments that have long-term payoffs. So providing districts with, I think if you provide districts with opportunities to have funding available for capital investments, that will help them prioritize such things. In terms of strategies for actually changing the minds of district leaders, I can't speak to necessarily what sort of techniques would be best, but I think presenting them with what data is out there on the environmental effects of school transportation can be helpful. And I think reports like what we put out recently hopefully will help drive those conversations, as there's more research and data available on just how effective or just how beneficial these types of improvements can be for students, especially for students' health and for students' test scores.
Great, thanks. We're getting a little low on time, so I'll combine two here, and maybe we can squeeze one more in at the end, but I'll at least combine these two about partnerships. So one is asking if you're familiar with any pilot programs that combine school buses and public transit. And then another of these questions is about partnerships between school districts and utility companies, and wondering if that's been shown to increase the amount of electric buses that a district will purchase.
Sure. So on the public transit front, I don't know of any coordination specifically around environmental impact. There are also some federal regulations known as TRIPPER regulations, that's TRIPPER, which do put some limits on the extent to which school districts can work with public transit directly for school transportation. That's because federal transit agencies are often federally funded, and so there are competition concerns if they are working too closely with school districts. But there are certainly districts that do use a combination of yellow buses and public transit. New York comes to mind. DC also comes to mind as a district that entirely uses public transit and only provides yellow bus service for student populations that are required under federal law. And in terms of the second part of that question with utility companies, I think that is definitely something that is happening a bit more now as more districts and states are looking at investing in electric school buses. That's in part prompted by some of this funding from the Volkswagen settlement that is now reaching states as they start up these projects. One of the case studies we have in the brief is of a school district in New York City called White Plains City School District. They're working with Consolidated Edison, the local utility company, to coordinate on using electric buses. And one of the things that they started doing this summer was testing the vehicle to grid technology, where essentially in exchange for helping fund that project, Con Ed will get to test the bus's batteries in terms of interacting with the power grid over the summer when buses aren't being used as much and when utilities are at their peak due to air conditioning needs, and testing and getting getting data on the effectiveness of those efforts. And that's something that still needs to be demonstrated in the field. So in White Plains, they're only using 5 of these electric buses, so it's certainly not implemented at scale, but it'll serve hopefully as a demonstration of whether and how those types of efforts can be most effective.
Great, thank you. I think that is all the time that we have for today, but this was really interesting. Thanks so much, Philip. And we will be posting the slides to our website after the fact and in the video, I believe, as well. So thanks again, all, for your participation. Eno is going to stay engaged in this larger issue. We hope to follow any more work that you all put out. For all the listeners that are still on the line, we'll be hosting a webinar on a similar topic on October 16th. That's titled, So You Want to Integrate Zero Emissions Buses into Your System. We will, before that one, be having a webinar on mobility data sharing and how cities are using new data for policy and planning, and that will be on October 8th. Information for both of those is available on our website. Once again, thank you for your participation and have a great afternoon.